To start, obviously, I would like to start with Obviamente, Imogen, now in Spanish. Can you start by telling us how did this story come about, the first steps of this new story?
Yeah, so this story has kind of an interesting origin story, I think. I started writing it a couple of years ago, and what led up to it was, it's really drawn very heavily from a lot of my own experiences in the publishing industry. So I had published a bunch of books by then, like most prominently Simon. And at the time when I wrote and published my first couple of books, I thought I was straight. I felt like I needed to kind of disclose that to audience. I had talked about that in interviews. And it was only after a couple of years that I was starting to question why I'd always been so drawn to queer stories, for example, among many other signs that in retrospect were very obvious. But what made things really complicated was there was a lot of discourse, there were a lot of conversations happening online at the time in particular about, should straight authors be writing queer books? Should queer stories only be told by queer people? Things like that. And so this conversation is swirling around me, and in my head, I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, is this real? Like, what is the truth kind of about my label? And ultimately in 2020, I ended up coming out as bi, and I felt like pressured to do it. It wasn't when I would have wanted to do it or how I would have wanted to. But I do feel like Imogen, Obviamente Imogen, that book was an opportunity for me to kind of process some of what that experience was like and work through it in a fictional setting. So Imogen is not an author, and she's not a public figure or anything like that with like online discourse in the same way. But she does have this friend named Gretchen, who Gretchen's dynamic with her kind of mirrors some of what I kind of internalized from social media and the discourse. So a lot of Imogen's feelings are drawn very closely from what my feelings were at the time.
How was the process of creating the characters besides Imogen, the best friend, and what is the most exciting part of having this journey with all of them?
Yeah, it's really fun getting to know the characters. It's frustrating for me at the beginning because for me it's very hard to write and tell this story until I feel like I know the characters, but I can't know the characters until I write. So the beginning is always like, I feel like I'm spinning my wheels a little bit, and I finally have to just dive in and trust that I will get to know these characters, and then I have to go back and rewrite a lot of stuff once I feel like I have a sense of each character's voice and who they really are. But in this case, a lot of it kind of clicked into place fairly naturally. Like, it was strange. I went into it feeling like there were a lot of kind of core aspects of each of these characters that I felt like I already knew. So I was just kind of bringing them to the surface. It almost didn't feel like I was creating them from scratch,
How was the self discovery, the exploration, the self-discovery?
Yeah, it was really, this book was so rewarding to write for many reasons. Like, one, because I kind of felt like I got to come out in the way that I wanted to. I got a do-over,
Okay.
But another thing that was really special about this process for me was because my own coming out was so fraught and it was so public and kind of and messy, and there was trauma. I didn't really get to engage with the humor of the fact that I had gone for a really long time. Like I was in my late 30s by the time I figured this out. And I cannot emphasize enough how many clues there were. Like some of the things that were a part of my life and my media consumption and just like the thoughts that I had as a like straight woman were so funny to look at in retrospect. And so I felt like with Imogen, I got to really like make fun of myself through making fun of her, kind of, but lovingly, you know.
One of the things that, of course, I enjoy the most is exactly the bi experience, because there's a lot of things to talk about. For a start, the bi erasure that we keep seeing, the fact that for personal experience, even sometimes the, how can I say, discrimination, I could say, comes within the queer communities. Like you have to explain not only double to them, and every time, at least from my personal experience, my straight friends, or they're like, okay, oh, so you're bi, okay, great. And I don't understand. It's the question of that. And I like that the book talks about these whole things that I got to understand that at some point, all the time in my life, maybe I'm going to have those questions to me. But I don't know. That's one of the good things. I would like to ask you exactly more about this issue of the bi character, and if you're aware of the impact of this type of stories that can have, because as similar as Simon, these are the stories that sometimes you're eager to see, to read, and I think it's wonderful that you've wrote it on this novel.
Thank you so much. It's so nice. I was like laughing at the way you described kind of just the contrast with like your straight friends and your, I mean, there's no universal bi experience, but man, that is familiar. Like that is, I think it's a very common experience among bi people, where a lot of times it's like the call is coming from inside the house, you know. For me, you know, I think a lot of the turmoil that I experienced around coming out came from fellow queer people who were kind of sizing me up and saying, like, is she really queer? You know, that she's basically straight. Why is she coming out? What is she hoping to gain from this? Is she doing this for more book sales? Like, and it's like, you know, it's a really painful thing to have that coming from the people who you feel like you want to be in community with. Sometimes it comes from other bi people even, sometimes, which I'm like, come on. But you know, at the same time, you know, other queer people have also like gone out of their way to be unbelievably welcoming and you know, and continue to and have like done just like the most in the best way to like make me feel like I belong here, and I'm so grateful for that. But yeah, it's a big, complicated, messy community, I think, you know.
What do you think is important as well to see those characters that are grown up, we could say, I mean, that are not teenagers, but they're also experiencing the change in their lives?
So this is such a good question. I think about this a lot because, you know, one of the things that I keep coming back to, right, is, you know, I feel like we are kind of, you know, getting older, learning more about ourselves as we age, like we collectively, right? But another thing to keep in mind is when you think about kind of the last couple of decades and just culturally what that has looked like in terms of conversations about queer people, sometimes it's easy to forget, I think, the degree to which the conversation has shifted. So when I think back to when I was growing up, and all these, anybody who you meet who comes out like later in life, like let's say you, you're thinking about people who come out, in their adulthood, 30s, 40s, older than that even in particular. Every single one of those people grew up in the 90s, the 80s, or earlier.
That's true.
And, when you think about what the media landscape looked like, for me, I didn't have a frame of reference for it. Like, it didn't even occur to me that I could be bi, because when I thought of, bisexual, to me, the only thing that I could kind of pin that word to was Maureen from Rent, who is iconic, so no shade to her, but I couldn't relate to her at all. Everybody was into her. I didn't get any action. Nobody was into me. So I'm like, I can't be that, and it didn't seem to fit, and it was a very narrow box that I had kind of put myself in. But I try to give myself grace, because I put myself in that box, at least partially because I grew up in the American South in a conservative suburb in the 80s and 90s,
One of the other things that I love also was the allyship. Tell us a little bit more about the characters trying to be an ally and all that, and what do you think are the keys to be a good ally for the LGBT community?
Yeah, it was so funny, especially writing this book, I think has done this to me, but now when I hear the word ally, my immediate association is like, oh, you haven't figured out you're queer yet, which is not true. That is a generalization.
Yes.
There are real people who are allies, not everybody's queer. But that was so a part of my experience. I really, really felt like I was an ally, and that's exactly kind of Imogen's whole thing, right? She it's so important to her to be supportive and to be present but not take up too much space and not invade spaces where it's supposed to be kind of a sacred space for queer people only. And she kind of ties herself in knots over that question. And it kind of creates some weird little
logical circles
in your head and stuff that make it very hard to unpack kind of what's really happening in your own mind. For me, it was very much the case when I go back to those early interviews that I mentioned where I'm talking about being straight. Part of why I'm talking about being straight in those interviews is I felt like as an ally, I had to be fully upfront and disclose I am straight, this is not my lane, just to be, I don't want anybody to feel like I'm pretending to tell their story, and and I think the reality is things are so much more fluid than that sometimes, especially with queerness. The thing about allies is not every ally is queer, but best practices, I do think it's helpful to leave room for the allies who will eventually figure out they're queer, because that is not an unusual pipeline, the overly invested ally to, oh, wait, I'm queer pipeline. But when I think about if, you are watching this and thinking about what can I do to be a better ally, and this is a question that you can ask if you are coming from outside the community or inside the community, because queer people can be allies for each other, especially kind of when you start to get into different labels. For me, it's really important to, as a cis person, it's really important for me to kind of always be mindful and make sure that kind of my words and actions are, just are in alignment with, kind of what the trans people in my life are talking about and saying is helpful and saying that they need from cis allies. So, a couple of things that I do kind of in my day-to-day life are, I try not to assume somebody's pronouns, and like if you mess up, you just apologize and try not to make it weird, and I try to use inclusive language. When I'm bugging my kids who won't tell me who they have a crush on, they will not tell me. But if I'm bugging them about it, I'll be like, do you have a crush on anybody? Not like, ooh, are there any cute girls,
Sure.
Just kind of being mindful to make that space. And then another thing that I certainly do that's really important to me and is maybe my this is an issue that's like so close to my heart, is that I always try to make space for closeted people who maybe don't know they're queer, maybe do know they're queer but don't want to come out, and maybe can't come out. It might not be safe to come out. And to always remember that, in every queer community conversation, there are likely to be people who are listening but aren't able to contribute and speak up as part of it. Yeah, so,
Okay.
yeah.
Of course, I want to talk about Simon, but I have two sides of this. One, how does it feel? How do you feel about the impact of the story? There goes the movie. There goes another series. As a professional, as a writer, how do you feel to see those characters coming to life? And on the other, the impact of the book that I assume you already know, that is, those characters are in our heart. It's been a very important book for a lot of people.
That's so kind. Yeah, it's really exciting. It's very surreal still. Particularly when I think about like the movie side of it and the fact that this movie exists. And I'm a huge fan of it and the series. I am like a really big fan, but I'm not, I don't work in Hollywood, I kind of forced myself onto the set a couple of times because I think it's incredible. And I loved every minute of seeing it. I particularly got to spend time on Love Simon's set because they filmed it in my town.
Mm-hmm.
And and then sometimes I still can't believe that came from my book. I remember watching, there's just one particular scene where they're like painting sets or something for the school play.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, this reminds me so much of being in high school. And then I'm like, it's because the book is based on my high school. Because I wrote the book. It's so strange, it hits you. But really, yeah, I feel very grateful. It's not something I ever expected. I would never take it for granted. But it has been really cool. And on a personal level, it has given me a lot. It is, I am maybe the most clueless person in the entire world. I am an absolute and total dodo bird, missing some very obvious signs. A lot of people don't figure out that they're queer until later. Not a lot of people write Love, Simon and several other queer books and still don't figure it out, right? That's elite, kind of elite level obliviousness. But I don't know that I would have gotten there without Simon and the other, Leah and all these other books. I kind of had to write my way there. So it's really special, in particular when somebody tells me that Simon helped them come out, because I'm kind of same, me too,
Right now we can see, fortunately, a variety of queer characters. For example, it's not only the bi that is a villain, that's okay, it's fine, but there's also some other cool guys or more sweet guys, etc. But from your perspective, from what you've lived in, it seems that sometimes we go one step forward and two steps backward. I know that is very different from 80s, 90s, because we have all these characters and all that, and they mean a lot. But I don't know, what are your thoughts about?
Yeah, and it's hard not to let it get to you, right? Because I,
Sure.
certainly see it. coming from the United States and coming from the southern part of the United States too, in particular, like the pendulum seems to be swinging in kind of a bad direction, and it's scary to watch. From like to kind of bring it in particular to the book space. There are suddenly so many book challenges and book bans, and usually what that looks like is a parent in the community will say that like a certain book is inappropriate, and then when you kind of actually look, if you're familiar at all with the book, you're like, oh, it's gay, it's queer, or it talks about race. Particularly books that talk about anti-Black racism are also targeted, but like queer books and especially trans books are often the first on the chopping block. And it's really sinister. It's a very small group of people who are behind it originally, but they're very well organized, and there are a lot of people who kind of are like, oh wait, it's there's inappropriate content in this book, and like there's a lot of confusion swimming around, and the people who are the ones getting hurt are these kids in the classroom who are losing access to these books because not every kid has a family who will buy those books for them, or not every kid has a family who can buy those books for them too. Money wise, privacy. There's so many reasons why like this access in schools and libraries is really important. And then you also have these kids who are internalizing this idea that like, oh, the people in my community think there's something wrong with me. There's something about me that is gross, or like that's less appropriate than my friend who isn't queer, And so the book bans are incredibly harmful and disheartening. But the thing I always want to make sure that any kids who are kind of living through that, whether that's in the U.S. or we've seen it in a lot of other countries as well, kind of similar, kind of conservative push, is really, truly, it is a small, organized group of people with an agenda. This is not the cultural consensus. Most people do not support book bans in general, and most people don't think that about you. This is a small group of people who are like trying to exert power in a very specific way. So I always want to push back on this idea that like, yeah, most people really think that about you, because it's not true.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to add? Some final message, Becky?
No, this has been lovely. I love talking to you. This has just been an amazing time. I'm so happy to be here in Guadalajara. Everybody I've met has been so kind, and I'm just grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Becky, for the time and for the time.